Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you.
Well, hi, and welcome to Northern Illawarra Uniting Church. Our sermon for this week, which is Easter Sunday. Christ is risen. It is good to have you with us. Our reading today comes from the Gospel of Luke, the resurrection narrative, starting in chapter 24, verse 1. Let me read this wonderful story for us. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what had happened. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. I was talking to a new member of our church the other day, someone who's just joined and not really familiar with church all that much. And he actually asked me, as we were talking, he said, "Well, do you actually have a real job?" And it made me laugh because I think that's a question that a lot of people have about ministers. What do we do all day apart from Sunday? And one quick summary of what a minister does, someone shared this with me once early in my ministry, was that ministers hatch, match, and dispatch. That is, we perform baptisms, we perform weddings, and we perform funerals. And in some ways, that's kind of being a minister can feel like that. It's a business-like engagement with some of the deep mysteries of life, birth, love, and death. And it can feel like that, especially when it comes to death. The business of baptizing, marrying, and burying people. And maybe every professional, doctor, funeral director, teacher feels that way. Everything, eventually even death, becomes one more job to do. And you know this if you've ever had to lay a loved one to rest. You've had a partner or a parent or someone you love. You know that death can feel in those moments very businesslike. Usually because death does not set a date, there's a lot of busyness when somebody dies. The next few days or maybe the week are extremely full. Meetings with ministers and funeral directors, so many forms to fill out. Decisions you never thought you'd need to make. What the deceased is to wear, decisions about caskets and wood and flowers and venues and hors d'oeuvres. And then there's the matter of what to do with the body, to cremate or to bury. It feels businesslike, busy. And in our culture, we have few traditions to guide us. And so sometimes it feels like all these decisions are made ad hoc. We make them up as we go along, which can add to the sense of busyness. And the choices become overwhelming and eventually just mundane. There is something very businesslike about death. But what's even harder than the busyness of death is the lack of busyness that follows in the days and weeks after a funeral. A few weeks after death, the rest of the world moves on. It returns to normal for everyone else. A few weeks after death, some people have said after a loved one has passed, someone will come up to them and simply say, "Oh, how are you?" And they look at your face and realize they've forgotten, but you haven't. The grief remains on the griever like a heavy stone. The only thing worse than the busy week before a burial is the quiet week that follows, when there is nothing else to do. Death in that moment feels incredibly real and final, both in what it demands of us and what it takes from us. Once the forms have been filled out and the body laid to rest, there is nothing else to do. There's nothing else to be done. Death means that the work is done. So in some ways, life can feel like carrying a heavy stone. It's heavy and hard to lift, and there's lots of huffing and puffing, a difficult task, but finally the stone is laid and it's done. In the book of Job in the Old Testament, there's a moving phrase that says, as a river dries up, so a mortal lies down and does not rise again. In the midst of all this business of death, its finality, its realness, talk of life and hope and resurrection can feel insubstantial. Nice words, but not really all that important. I mean, there are no forms to fill out with resurrection. The government is not particularly interested. No bills to pay or decisions to make. And if there's no form in our world, is that really real? Without these things, our hope feels less real than our grief. The words of the preacher proclaiming resurrection feel so much less real than the body lying in the casket. Of course, resurrection feels less real than death. Words about resurrection and hope feel so weak, like speaking and shouting and yelling at a stone. But that's what makes the story of the resurrection that we read today so remarkable. This story, the story of Jesus' resurrection, is just as businesslike. The reading we read in Luke and each of the gospel accounts of the resurrection are so matter of fact. They're not a philosophical or romantic texts. Luke's story begins with a scene of just regular busyness. After all the horrors and griefs of Jesus' death, the busy machinations of the Roman death machine, there is a day of rest, the Sabbath. And then on Sunday morning, the women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others, they get up early in the morning and bring spices to dress the body to stop the smell. And they are trying to honor Jesus after he died. And they have no sense that this moment is any different from every other burial that has happened before then and since. They are just about the business of burying. But when they get there, they don't find philosophical ideas or mystical things. What they find is three very plain things. The stone to the tomb has been moved. The grave is empty except for some linen grave clothes. And they find two men standing there reminding them of the words of Jesus. That he had told them that he would be tried, crucified, and on the third day, that morning, he would rise again. And the women faced with these three things remember that Jesus had said them. It doesn't say they believed him. It just says they remembered. They're frightened because they're confused, and they run back and tell the disciples, tell the men. And the disciples don't believe them, but Peter at least goes to check, and he only finds linen clothes in an empty tomb. And he too is confused. He goes home wondering. This is how the gospel accounts of the resurrection read, not as a philosophical treatise on the immortality of the soul, not high-minded rhetoric about hope overcoming despair. These accounts read like any orderly, business-like burial being interrupted in a very unsettling but very matter-of-fact way by the resurrection. It's almost as though over the grave, a train conductor says normal services have been disrupted. There are some pretty cheap responses to the resurrection that have been given over the years. One of them is that people back then, the disciples, the women in particular, were especially credulous and gullible. They were all too quick to believe any old thing, any old miracle. Resurrection, no problem. Happens all the time. But that's arrogant on our part. I mean, dead means dead, and it meant the same thing back then. Read the gospel accounts. The followers of Jesus did not expect him to rise from the dead, even though he said he would. They fully expect him to find him in the tomb. This criticism of the disciples, especially the women, is not new. People have been calling Mary and her friends hysterical for centuries. A few decades after Jesus' resurrection, a man named Celsus, a Greek philosopher and opponent of early Christianity, wrote this about the resurrection story. He says the chief witness, Mary, is a hysterical female. half crazy from fear and grief, and possibly one other of the same band of charlatans who dreamed it all up or saw what they wanted to see, or more likely simply wanted to astonish their friends in the tavern with a good tale. Celsus and many others saw Mary as an unreliable witness because she was, in particular, a woman. In those days, a woman's testimony was not as valid as a man's. But for historians today, actually, Mary's presence in this narrative is actually a convincing element. Because if you wanted to make up a credible story that would convince people of the day, convince the people around the disciples, the last person that you would place at the tomb first is Mary, a woman whose testimony was not considered fully valid, a woman who had a history of demon possession or mental illness or whatever you want to call it, but she was not the best person to be an eyewitness unless you were simply telling the story as it actually happened. The fact is, Mary and the other women were the first to arrive at the tomb. That's what happened. This alone should tell us that the authors, at the very least, are not trying to make something up. But we can say more about what happened on that morning. Some think that the disciples were so eager to believe in Jesus that they simply imagined or made up that he was raised, that somehow their faith inspired them to tell stories about Jesus even though they knew they weren't true. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus was not the only one who claimed to be Messiah. There were plenty of other people who claimed to be messiahs: Judas of Galilee, Theudas, Simon of Perea, and most famously, the one that we probably know the most about is a man named Simon Bar Kokhba, a man who claimed to be the Messiah just after Jesus. But each of these claimants, including Simon Bar Kokhba, they died. And do you know what happened after they died? Nothing. Their followers scattered. It makes sense. No one was willing to lay down their life for a dead Messiah. But that's exactly what the disciples did, unless they really knew that Jesus was alive. So we must believe that something happened with Jesus. Even if you don't believe the resurrection, even if you're not a Christian, I think it's right for us to believe that something happened. Those first Christians didn't think something new or believe something new. No, these first people believed because they saw something new. It didn't make sense to them at first. They experienced something that was completely unexpected. It was not faith that made the resurrection, but resurrection that created faith. It's not the church that made up resurrection. It's the resurrection that created the church. It's not changed hearts that made up the resurrection. It's the resurrection that changed hearts. Something happened. We know that death happens. Death is like this heavy stone and we can't get our way around it. It's there. What are you going to do? What the Gospels tell us is the resurrection is a heavier stone that lands in the world like an asteroid. And it doesn't lie there. It shakes the earth. Everything is changed. It shakes the earth, sending ripples out. The stone of the resurrection, the risen Jesus, has landed in this world. Something happened, and the ripples flow out from there. Mary's despair turned to hope. Peter's confusion was turned to courage and conviction. Thomas' doubt was turned to belief. The disciples' fear was turned to courage, and these ripples kept going out. Things kept happening. All these historical realities that shifted dramatically after the resurrection. The Jewish followers of Jesus who had worshipped for generations and generations on the Sabbath started to change and worship on the Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. If you know anything about the Jewish faith, you know that to change the Sabbath was something unheard of, but something had happened that changed everything. A new Sabbath day, a new day of rest, Resurrection Sunday. The ripples kept going out and things changed, things happened. Jews and Gentiles who never spoke began to worship together, calling each other brothers and sisters. Why? Because something happened that changed everything. And the ripples kept going out outside of Jerusalem through Judea and out to the Roman Empire. Slaves and women and barbarians stopped fearing death, fearing disease, fearing the emperor, and started claiming their dignity and calling as God's children, God's people. Something happened. The asteroid of life-giving power from which the earth itself shifted and ripples of hope spread throughout the whole world. It's not mystical, it's historical, it's real. And eventually, These ripples flowed out, and the apex predator of the ancient world, Rome in all her martial power, submitted to the crucified carpenter from Nazareth. And the cross, which was a symbol of death and terror that the Romans used to subjugate whole peoples, became a symbol of hope and life that inspired people. I've been reading a historian recently he's not a Christian, he's just a guy who really has unpacked the origins of the early church. And he writes this, not from a position of faith, but from a position of history. He says this, and I'll put it up on the screen because it's such a great quote. He says, "To be a Christian is to believe that God became man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. This is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it has always been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution." It is the audacity of it, the audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the creator of the universe, that serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and of the civilization to which it gave birth. Today, the power of this strangeness remains as alive as it has ever been. All are heirs to the same revolution, a revolution that has at its molten heart the image of a God dead on a cross. Friends, the world was changed by this event, not by thought or philosophy or theology or even religion. It was changed by the event of the resurrection. But to bring it to a smaller scale, even on that morning, that first ripple, that first moment, something changed. It changed for Mary. Mary was a woman in a world that never listened to women. Mary was a person with a long history of pain and trauma, demon-possessed or mentally ill, troubled, with a checkered past. But when that asteroid of life-giving power landed in the world, Mary was the one who was first to be caught in its ripples. And she went and told others. And person to person has passed on this truth. And now, even now, I pass it on to you. God raised Jesus from the dead, and nothing will ever be the same. I don't want to inspire you with moving words. I want to declare the simple truth that changes everything, that there is a sure and certain hope for every single person, and you can believe it. It's the same hope that Mary experienced on that resurrection morning. And perhaps the ripple has caught up to you as well. That this quiet, matter-of-fact business of that Easter Sunday morning, when the deepest and dearest hopes of all humanity, that we are meant for more than death, met with the reality of a risen Jesus. Jesus Christ is risen, and everything else has changed. In the business of this world, death means that the work is done. If we hope in the resurrection, the work of renewal has only just begun. May the ripples flow through you and in you today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.